See if it's a process.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Servet Yatin, and I have the honor of serving as the Provost and Chief Academic Officer of Quincy College. Thank you all for coming. I know I speak for Quincy College community when I tell you how genuinely touched we are by your tremendous interest in and support for our first scholarly conversations. At Quincy College, we are truly blessed with enormous talent. We have among us teachers, scholars, scientists, and poets. And sometimes all of those talents just in one person. This event, organized by the Scholarship Teaching and Learning team, is not just a way to showcase our talent. It is a way for us to say thank you to our community and all of the support you provide us. We have 3 speakers, and I will have the honor of introducing each individually. A Q&A will follow after each speaker, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. Please silence your cell phones for the remainder of the evening. Restrooms are outside near the entrance, and you know there will be blood. In case of emergency, please follow the red exit signs. Without further ado, I would like to introduce President Cristofaro, who has been a great supporter of this event and whose leadership is guiding us into the future. President Cristofaro.
It's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much. So many faculty that are here to be so supportive, and so many people from the community. And I know Dr. Yatin had that all planned out. This was going to be so perfect, and it really has gotten onto a terrific start. One thing that I need to say is that we don't, me, not necessarily everyone else, I don't think about faculty in a way that a presentation type of thing, a showcase, and I should have, because we are so fortunate to have an incredible faculty. Not only are they what they know is so important, the real thing is that that's who they are. Who they are is just something that we can't teach, no one can teach. It's intrinsic, it's just what they do. And what they do with our students is magic. Magic, and I salute them very, very much. I know I speak for Servet as well. So with that, all I can do is say thank you for being here. Faculty, you're incredible speakers, unbelievable, and I wish you the best of luck. You'll be great. So thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, President Cristofaro. Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jim Fox from our History Department. Professor Fox graduated from University of Illinois and completed his graduate work at Boston University. He has been teaching at Quincy College for 15 years. Prior to moving to Quincy, Professor Fox lived and worked in England, France, and what was known at the time called Czechoslovakia. Among his many scholarly interests is the French Revolution that he describes as the most dramatic and complex events in modern history. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jim Fox.
All right, I haven't done a sound check. Does it sound okay? Thank you, Provost Yatin, President Cristofaro. Thank you, all of you, for being here tonight. Really appreciate everyone showing up. I almost feel guilty for what I'm going to put you through. Because as Provost Yai said, the French Revolution was a very complicated, very complex event. And I never realized that more than when I tried to put a 20-minute talk about it together. So I'm going to try to focus on a few aspects of the revolution to give us something to look for when we go through the whole complex event. And I want to begin by asking just a couple of simple questions. Now, here in America, we celebrate the 4th of July as our national holiday. Does anyone know what the national holiday, the date for the national holiday of France is? The 14th of July. Now, we celebrate the anniversary of independence on July 4th. What are the French celebrating on July 14th? Bastille Day, all right? The anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. All right. One of the things I want to do tonight is try to make the point that celebrating the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille on July 14th is actually not entirely true. It's a little complicated. Now, another easy question. I'm going to ask you to finish this motto. I'm going to begin it and ask you to finish it. Divided we stand, united we stand. I just gave everything away. United we stand, divided we fall. Okay. Again, what I want to do in the next few minutes is show that a study of the French Revolution suggests that actually the opposite can be true. And the result will be the title of this talk, as it will roll. All right, so to begin, I want to begin with a familiar face. Work it up. Louis XVI, King of France. Who is his wife? Marie Antoinette. Okay, good. Educated crowd. They were married as teenagers around 1770. He was coronated crowned king in 1774. And at the coronation, he was anointed with holy oil. So he was sacred as well as king. And he is the sovereign. All sovereignty of the kingdom resides in the body and person of the king. So let's fast forward to 1789. Louis XVI, he's well dressed, he's well fed, he's sacred, he's the sovereign, but he's also broke. The royal government was bankrupt. Now, in order for the government to function, he needs to borrow money. But no one wants to lend him money because he's broke. He's not a safe investment. So what he has to do is show potential investors that the future looks bright. He needs a reform package. And it would help if he has the support of the kingdom behind this reform. It'll show that it'll work. Now, the best way to have the support of the kingdom is to have them participate in the reform process. So Louis is going to rejuvenate a medieval institution known as the States General. It's the closest thing that France had to our Congress today or Britain's Parliament. It's going to meet at Versailles, the royal residence, about 10 miles southwest of Paris. And there's a couple problems with the States General. One is the way it's structured. Now, our Congress has how many parts? Two, right? The Senate and the House. Just like the British Parliament has two parts. The States General is divided into three because it's supposed to reflect the structure of society. And it was believed at the time that society was structured into three estates or three orders. Now, this might be familiar to some of you, but the first estate, of course, were those who pray, that's the clergy. The second order were those who fight, that's the nobility. And the third estate was everyone else. I suspect most of us lie in that third estate. It's those who work. Now, the way that the States General would vote is to vote by order. So everyone knew that when Louis called this into being to help reform, if there was a tax proposal that, for example, would weigh most heavily on the third estate, and they voted by order, then the first estate would say, yes, the third estate's going to pay it, that's great. The second order would do the same, and then the third estate would say, well, no, that's not fair, but it's 2 votes against 1, so they would lose. This is an image of how the third estate saw the structure of society. Literally, the clergy and the nobility are getting a free ride on the back of those who work. So this Estates General is not just an opportunity for Louis XVI to reform the government, but for the third estate, it's an opportunity to make even more profound reform society, to right this wrong. All right, here's an image of the opening day ceremony. This is in May of 1789. And you can see, you might be able to see that the clergy are sat on one side, the aristocracy there, and the third estate is right in the middle facing the king up on his throne. After these speeches, the king asked each order to go to the designated room to start work. But the third estate doesn't want to move. They don't want to do anything in separate orders. They refuse to do anything until all three estates agree to work together. Because they know that'll be a precedent when they come to vote. Instead of voting by order, they could vote individually. And there's always a few liberal nobles and clergy who would vote with the third estate. Well, the third estate invites the other states to join them. They don't, and for the first few weeks, the States General gets nothing done. Eventually, in June, the third estate said, enough is enough, enough is enough. If you don't want to join us, we'll do it alone. And they declare themselves to be the National Assembly. A few liberal nobles and clergy do join them, so that gets the king's attention. Here he's got the third estate taking charge of the States General. He'd been distracted because his son had died recently after the first week of the States General. So he wasn't really paying attention, but now his wife, Marie Antoinette, and his younger brothers are urging him to take some kind of action. So Louis XVI is going to call a royal session, a royal meeting, him and the States General. And he'll make a few concessions, token concessions, but then he'll make sure that the National Assembly stops calling themselves that, and they go back to the three estates. Louis doesn't want to mess with the old order. All right, well, when the National Assembly, or third estate, when they go to their room to do a normal day's work, before they know about the king's plans to have a meeting, they go to their room and they find it locked because the king is preparing it, because that's the place he's going to have the royal meeting. Not only is it locked, but there's a royal guard outside. And the National Assembly, they assume that the king is preparing to use force to arrest them, maybe imprison them. So what they do, they're locked out of their room. It's raining on June 20th, 1709. They find the only big space where they can all fit in and have shelter from the rain, and it's an indoor tennis court. And there they take an oath. They confirm that they are the National Assembly, and they refuse to go home until they've written a constitution for France. The king will still be king, but he'll be limited by law like everyone else. They'll set up a constitutional monarchy. All right, well, the king is not on board with this, but he keeps quiet. Doesn't want to provoke anything, but in the coming days, he orders troops to come from the borders and head towards Paris. And news of the movement of the troops travels more quickly than the troops themselves, so the people of Paris know the troops are coming. Consequently, the Parisians look for weapons and arms wherever they can to defend themselves. And one of the places where they know they can find what they're looking for is in a medieval castle, which had been built in the Middle Ages on the edge of the city to protect Paris. But over the centuries, because the city had grown, that fortress was now in the middle of a working class neighborhood in the east of Paris. What was that fortress called? The Bastille, exactly. And on July 14th, the Bastille is stormed. The commander of the fortress had refused to let anyone in, but when he was finally forced to surrender, he surrendered with the promise that he'd be kept safe, but his head ended up on a pike, along with a couple of other officials in Paris within 24 hours. But heads on pikes don't roll, so we're not where we're supposed to be fighting. In fact, things kind of calm down. The king goes back to Versailles, again, keeps quiet. The National Assembly is going to set to work. And after a few weeks, by the end of August 1789, they've written what they plan to be the preamble to the upcoming Constitution. And that preamble is a Declaration of Rights. And it might sound kind of familiar when you look at the first couple of articles. I'm only going to pick three. It's a quite long document. But in Article 1, the National Assembly declares that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Does that sound reminiscent of anything? Yeah. All men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson is in Paris at this time, and he'll be in Paris. He'll be in France until September. And he's actually having meetings with some of the leaders of the revolution where they're drafting this Declaration of Rights in his house. Now, He's the U.S. representative to the court of King Louis XVI, and he's inviting revolutionaries into his house. This is not the only example of Thomas Jefferson behaving badly. That's another story. The second article that I want to mention is Article 3, is when the National Assembly insists that all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. Now, when I had the picture of Louis XVI up, I made the point of pointing out that when he was king, he was sovereign. He was the font of all sovereignty in the nation. And now the Assembly is saying the people are. That's a big change. The last example from this long document that I wanted to point out is that the very last article declares that property is an inviolable and sacred right. Now, again, a few minutes ago, when I had the picture of the king up, I made the point of saying the king was sacred. Now, is property that's sacred. Some people argue that this is the heart of the entire revolution. Now, if I were to pretend like I was a therapist or something, and I was going to say something and ask you to tell me the first thing that you see in your mind, what object do you see? And I say, French Revolution. What do you see?
The guillotine.
The guillotine, okay. The revolution in some ways is complete here, and the guillotine is not even invented yet, right? It's a couple of years in the making. So, what's going on? Why will heads roll? Seems kind of peaceable. If we fast forward to the first anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, we see something very interesting, and that is a national celebration. It's a celebration not of the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. It's a celebration of reconciliation after the fall of the Bastille. It's a celebration of unity. It's called the Festival of the Federation because it includes what they called federate. They were representatives of the communities throughout the kingdom, and they come together to celebrate harmony, peace, and unity. The three estates are recognized at this meeting. You've got the nobility, there's a clergyman, and even the king is present. It's the entire nation celebrating together. It's as if they have no idea what's about to happen. Don't forget that date, July 14th, 1790, the Festival of the Federation. All right, let's see what's happening. We can't talk about everything, obviously, because it's a very complicated event, but I'm curious to see what's happening on July 14th in 1791 and 1792. In June of 1791, Louis XVI, who's meant to be the king in this constitutional monarchy, escapes Paris with his family. They'll be caught, they'll be brought back. The National Assembly tries to spin some fake news saying he didn't escape, he was kidnapped. Because they're writing a constitution that requires him to be king. It's a bit awkward when shortly after they made public a letter that was found at the king's desk the night that he escaped. And basically he wrote, "I hate the revolution, I'm escaping." It's in his handwriting. So it's a bad situation when the National Assembly finally succeeds in writing their constitution. Now there's obviously no celebration because people have their doubts about the king. But in October, the new constitution is approved and the first elected assembly is created. It's the Legislative Assembly. And again, don't forget, the king is part of this government. But there's growing divisions in French society. Members of this new Legislative Assembly are looking for ways that they can unify the people behind the king, or at least behind themselves. And they're looking for some topic, something that could unite a country. What would be a really interesting thing for the government to do to unite the people?
Wage war against somebody else.
Exactly. They declare war. They declare war against Austria. Did you know you were right, Henry?
Yes.
Okay. Austria is a traditional enemy of France. It's kind of complicated because, of course, Marie Antoinette herself is from Austria. She's an Austrian princess. But there you go. The king himself, Louis XVI, is okay with this. He's on board with this declaration of war because he figures if the French win, then he's the king of the victorious nation. And you don't rally around the flag in the 18th century, but you would rally around the king. And if they lose, that's even better, because they'll be losing to Austria. And Marie Antoinette's nephew will militarily occupy Paris and restore the king and queen in full power. So it's a win-win situation. It's like, what could go wrong, right? All right, well, April of 1792 is just by coincidence. There's no connection with the war, but it is when the guillotine is first used. And as many of you probably know, the guillotine was meant to be a very humane way to put people to death, and it was an equalizer. It used to be that aristocrats had the honor of being beheaded, and everyone else had to be hanged, but now everyone's going to have an equally pleasant, apparently they said, death, with a national razor. All right, but at this point, it's just used for criminal offenses. It's not a political tool yet. All right. By July of 1792, on the eve of another potential celebration of July 14th, Prussia has joined the war, and France is being invaded. So obviously, no one's planning any celebrations to celebrate the 14th. All right. Also, the following month in August, enough people are fed up with this charade of a constitutional monarchy that the king's palace, he'd been moved to Paris by this time, was stormed, and the monarchy is overthrown. This attempt at a constitutional monarchy is over. So, there are new elections. The new assembly is going to be called a convention. So I said, I'm sorry I have to do this to you. Lots of names here. But the convention is going to get to work at writing yet another constitution. Not with a king, but as a republic. So they declare France a republic. They put the king on trial. They find him guilty. And he loses about 25 pounds. January 21st, 1793, just a short while ago, was his anniversary. All right. Now, the divisions are growing because the war is escalating. France has declared war on Great Britain, Spain, and the Dutch, and the war is not going well. To make matters even worse, because this government, they not only killed the king, but by this time they've confiscated all the lands of the Catholic Church, reorganized the church, and made priests civil servants. So they've attacked king and church. Now the war is going badly. No one wants to volunteer. So the government is drafting soldiers to fight in this. It's not surprising that counter-revolutionary civil war erupts, and is centered primarily in the Vendée region on the Atlantic coast. The country is more divided than ever. All right. Could it get worse? Yes or no? It's going to get worse. Because not only is the French revolutionary government fighting counter-revolutionaries, but enough revolutionaries, people who are for the revolution, who live in the cities of France, they're so upset with Paris being in control of it. They killed the king, even. Not that the other cities minded so much, but it would have been good to be asked, right? So other cities like Bordeaux, Lyon, Marseille, they rebelled. So now you've got a second civil war, one against the revolution and the other, oddly, with the revolution. All right. Now, the new constitution written by the convention for a republic is approved, but because of the crisis, you can't have normal political debate. Decisions have to be made quickly. So they put the new constitution in a box and they hang it from the ceiling of the convention hall, literally suspending it. And they set up committees to make decisions, expedite legislation. The most important committee is the Committee of Public Safety. Now, in July of 1793, no one's even thinking about celebrating anything. If you read the newspapers in July of 1793, you'll find out that a certain individual named Robespierre becomes a member of the Committee of Public Safety, the one that's really running the government at this point. And the only way that this committee sees of this new republic surviving all these crises is to institute a regime of laws that are collectively known as the terror. This is when, if you're accused of being a counter-revolutionary, if you're accused of being a foreign spy, if you're accused of supporting the Federalists, if you're accused of not having the virtue required by a republic, you've got no choice but to be eliminated. And this is when tens of thousands of French, innocent, guilty, hard to say, but they're all headless because of the terror. Now, the crises one by one are taken care of. The Vendée is pacified. The Federalist revolts crushed brutally, tens of thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of people killed in the Vendée. Just blood everywhere. The war actually turns in France's favor. Instead of being invaded, France is invading its neighbors. So the threats that justify the terror cease to exist really by the time you get to the summer of 1794. So, Robespierre is going to fall. This is the table that the Committee of Public Safety works on. This is 6 of the 12 members. Can you make out what color that table is? Green, yeah. It's the same table that Robespierre's body is going to be put on when he's arrested. He tries to escape. He gets wounded. He's shot in the jaw. His jaw is literally dangling. But they tie it back onto his head so that he can survive long enough to be guillotined the next day. But that's the month of Thermidor. We call it the month of July. I've talked about division. The French government was divided against counter-revolutionaries. The government was divided against itself in the Federalist revolts. They were divided against the past, their own past. Thermidor is a month that aligns with July in the revolutionary calendar. This is our traditional calendar, January, February, March, April, May in French. But to break with that past, a past that had a king and an old-fashioned Catholic church, they come up with a revolutionary calendar where the months are named after the typical weather of that period. You have a rainy month and a snowy month, and so on. July is a hot month, so it's Thermidor. And you have 3 weeks instead of 4, and 1 day at the end of each week, so 1 day weekends. 3 weekend days per month. I hope Prison College never
Don't get any
pursues
ideas.
that type of change, but there you go. Not only is the revolution breaking with time, and I'm running out of time myself, but they redraw out the map of France. This is the traditional map of France. Some of you will recognize regions like Burgundy or Normandy, where the D-Day invasions were. These are ancient provinces. But the French Revolution gets rid of all that, creates a new administrative map with departments. That, unlike the calendar, survives even today. All right, so in conclusion, why do the French celebrate July 14th, 1789, when it is part of a series of events that become so bloody? The easy answer is they don't. When the law was created to make July 14th the national holiday, there's no reference to 1789. This is the Third Republic in 1880, and they were thinking of 1790, the Festival of Federation, that celebration of unity and whatnot. And people don't know. You might wonder, well, why do we call it Bastille Day? They don't. We do, right? In English. For them, it would be the Fête Nationale, or the 14 Juillet, the 14th of July, which makes sense. And finally, that united we stand, divided we fall. I think we can agree that the French Revolution was anything but united, but it stood. And there's a lesson learned. What does the French Revolution show? What will happen when a nation stands divided?
Heads will roll.
Let's go roll. All right, thank you very much. I started 10
I'm in his office, man.
Yeah. So how much time do we have for questions? 7 minutes?
7 minutes.
I think we'll be around after too if anyone has any questions. But I'm to point at anyone who has questions. And I guess, Colin, you're going to go around with the microphone?
There you go.
Cheryl, then,
Davis first?
yeah, is this on? Yes.
Yes. Yes, it is.
I was wondering, how come the French Revolution turned out so different from the American Revolution?
Obviously, that's a good question. I think the basic thing to keep in mind is that the American Revolution is really not a revolution, in a way. All right? The Americans really they were used to self-government in colonial America. It was only when in the 1760s and 1770s that Parliament began to impose taxation, attempts at taxation, and the colonials felt that their tradition of self-government was being threatened that day as sparked action. So when the revolution happened and the colonies broke away, they weren't really creating, this is debatable, and I'm going to oversimplify, but they weren't really creating something new. They were preserving what they had, that relative autonomy. And the people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they were the elites before the revolution, and they were the elites after as well. Whereas, very different case. Yes, sir?
So what drove them to attack all their neighbors? Did they have that many more people, and they're killing tens of thousands of people? How could they ever have actually started to win?
Right, okay. You're introducing lots of interesting ideas. Initially, the question was about why France declared war against everybody. And initially it was partly to unite the nation around a cause and to expose people who weren't for the revolution, because they would have to come out in public for or against the war. But the war escalates when France declared war on Great Britain and the Dutch and Spain. It was really preemptive because they were going to be attacked. So why wait for them to attack? But then the question of how did they think they could pull that off? They were fighting royal armies, the armies of kings. Soldiers weren't really motivated because they weren't fighting for themselves, they were fighting for a monarch. The French Republican armies, a country founded on the idea that sovereignty resided in the nation, they believed they were fighting for themselves. So the nation in arms. Very motivated.
Gary Walden.
Nice to see you.
See you. Maybe a simple question, but you talked about Prussia and Austria. Is that the same country?
No. Austria was a distinct kingdom.
Okay.
That was partly in something called the Holy Roman Empire, and partly not, because you're going to regret asking this question. There is no Germany yet.
Okay.
It's something, again, called the Holy Roman Empire, which was hundreds of different states and principalities and cities and bishoprics. It was very complicated. So Prussia was just one of these states, but it was it was one of the more powerful ones, probably the most powerful.
Okay.
And Prussia will spearhead the unity of Germany. Actually, well, okay, I won't get into it.
Thank you.
It gets complicated. It's a whole other time. Yes.
Was Thomas Jefferson, you mentioned he was there in August and September. Did he come back at all during any of this time?
No. When I teach the American Revolution, and I mentioned that Thomas Jefferson was in,
Right.
He was Mr. Liberty. He was always saying, oh, rebellion is a good thing. And it would be okay if there was a fight for freedom and everyone died, but there was one Adam and one Eve and they were free. And you're like, what? Really radical. And I always think it's interesting that when he's in France and the revolution begins, he's gone within weeks. Yeah. Now, again, it might be a cheap shot because apparently Jefferson was planning on returning, but never got around to it. He became Secretary of State in America, but yes.
So Hamilton was right about him?
Possibly. Not a big fan of Jefferson.
Yeah. Where was Thomas Paine during the French Revolution, and how soon after did Napoleon come on the scene?
Okay. Paine, quite a colorful character, a hero of the American Revolution, but he was broke for reasons we can't get into. So after the American Revolution, he goes to England, where he tries to sell plans for a bridge that he designed. It was the Enlightenment. It made sense then. But he's in England, Thomas Paine was, when the French Revolution broke out. And some of you might know Edmund Burke is going to write a very famous book denouncing the French Revolution early in the Revolution. Thomas Paine will write an equally famous text defending the Revolution. And the King of England found Thomas Paine's book so offensive that he was going to be arrested and was told so. And Thomas Paine fled into France, revolutionary France. This is probably 91, 92, I forget exactly. But he doesn't speak French, but he's a hero in France because he was a hero of the American Revolution. And everybody was saying, kissing Monsieur Paine, and he's like, oh, okay. Great. He's made an honorary an honorary member of the convention. So this is 1793. He's in the government, and he hardly speaks any French. And again, he's a hero of the American Revolution. But when war breaks out and the convention declares war against England, some of the convention members say, "Monsieur Payne, you are English, no?" He's like, "Oui." Then they, he figures out what they're saying. No, I'm American. He's arrested and he's thrown in jail. And he writes letters to George Washington. "Come on, George, you know me. Tell the French I'm American. Get me out of jail." And George Washington's like, "Oh, I'm president now. I can't get involved in personal affairs." and Payne's gonna swallow in jail for a while. And Payne was actually supposed to be executed around the time of Thermidor. And I get the story wrong. Basically, the night before he's supposed to be executed, he's got a cold. And he asked for permission to have his door open to let some ventilation in. And he gets the okay. And that night, when they're marking the doors that have to be, the guys who have to be executed, they marked Thomas Paine's door, and then in the morning, the door was closed, so the marking wasn't seen. This could be vice versa, but it's one of those things. So he survived. Now, Steve, I'm afraid I think I've drifted away from the question. Okay, but Paine will he'll eventually get out of jail, return to America when his friend Thomas Jefferson is president. But Paine doesn't have a happy ending, but that's another end. And
When did Napoleon come on the scene?
Napoleon he's actually gonna be a friend of the Robespierres.
Yeah.
So he's a Montagnard. He's an up-and-coming young general. He's fighting in the South during this time. When Robespierre is overthrown, Napoleon will be thrown in jail for a little while. But after a couple weeks, the revolutionary government, they know they need talented generals, so he's released. And eventually in 1799, Bonaparte will be involved in a coup d'etat which overthrows the Republic, and the empire begins. And that is very much another story. But it's a good story too. All right, I think the time is up. All right, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Professor Fox. Do we want part 2 from him sometimes in the future? Yeah. Yay. All right, who among you loves cats? Yay. Well, like them or not, you will love this presentation by Dr. Mariana Matrajt. Dr. Matrajt earned her doctoral degree in biology from University of Buenos Aires, where she focused her research on molecular biology and infectious diseases. She then moved to United States for her postdoctoral training on microbiology and genetics at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to joining Quincy College faculty in 2014, Dr. Matrajt ran a research laboratory on microbial pathogenesis at the University of Vermont. As a former chemistry professor myself, science has a special place in my heart. And I know that by the end of this presentation, it will have a special place in your heart as well. Please join me welcoming Dr. Mariana Matrajt.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Now we have a completely switching topics. I'm going to tell you about this parasite that can make you fearless. So here you're looking at the picture of Toxoplasma Gondii. This is a causative agent of toxoplasmosis. This parasite can infect a wide range of animals, including house pets and farm animals and wild animals and human beings. And it's very successful. It's distributed all around the world. It is estimated that about 30% of the human population is infected. But why don't you see it in the news, right? 30% is a big number. But the infection is normally asymptomatic, which means that most people get infected without knowing. And this is also known as a cat parasite. And why cat? Because that's the place where the parasite reproduces best. It really needs the cat to reproduce there. And the parasite gets shed in the cat feces. That's how it gets out to the environment. And it gets shed in this form that is called oocyst. That's, to simplify that, that's like a spore. And in the sense that it remains in the environment for a long period of time. And this is how a lot of animals get infected, by inhaling these parasite spores or by eating other animals that are infected as well. Now in nature, mice and rodents play a central role in spreading infection, because when infected mice get eaten by cats, that's how the infection gets spread out. And how do we get infected? Humans, right? There are two major ways in which we can get infected. Undercooked meat. All farm animals can be infected, and indeed they are. So if you don't cook your meat very well, that's one major way. Another way is by cleaning the cat litter box. And this is why you might have heard that doctors tell pregnant women to do not change the cat litter. This could be devastating during pregnancy. In most people it's asymptomatic, but pregnancy is one of the situations where you really want to get far away from this parasite. It could cause neurological birth defects. And now coming back to the parasite, when the parasite goes out to the environment, it faces a real challenge, which is coming back to the cat, right? So it's a tiny microorganism that doesn't have any legs to find the cat again. So it has to ensure that somehow it keeps reproducing. And this is when the biology becomes weird. There is a famous experiment that was done. Like if you put mice in a cage, and in one corner of the cage, you put cat urine. What you would see is that the mice run away from the cat urine, right? So they go to the other side of the cage, the stress hormones raise, and that's kind of expected because they don't want to get eaten. Now, if you do the same experiment, but you put Toxoplasma infected mice, what you see is that the mice go towards the cat urine. They get attracted, they get curious about it. So from the point of view of the parasite, that's great, because if infected mice get attracted to cats, it's more likely that they would get eaten and more chances for the parasite to come back to the cat. Now this was very surprising, and a lot of scientists got really interested in understanding how, right? So how this is happening? How is this tiny parasite changing the mice behavior? And at this point, neuroscientists got involved in this study.
What a slide.
And first I should say that when the parasite infects animals, it disseminates throughout the body and then switches to a dormant form that goes to the brain. So the parasite sits in the brain for the lifetime of the animal. And the other thing we should know is that brains usually have different regions that they are specialized in different things. For example, there is a part of the brain that is specialized in processing visual images. And there is another part of the brain that is specialized in responses to fear. It's called the fear center of the brain. It's in the part that is called the amygdala. And this parasite knows how to get there it actually knows how to get to the fear center of the brain. And this is what neuroscientists discovered, right? And they did another important experiment where if you take mice, normal mice, and you expose them to caruni, what you would see is that the fear center of the brain lights up. In other words, there is a response, that region of the brain responds, right? And that would be normal because, again, mice should have fear to cats. And now, when this experiment was done again with infected mice, Toxoplasma infected mice, what neuroscientists saw is that the fear center did not respond. But instead, they saw another region of the brain lighting up. And that was a region that is related to sexual attraction. And it turns out that actually the sexual attraction circuitry is very close, physically close to the fear center of the brain. So the parasite was able to reroute fear into sexual arousal. And after scientists discovered this, they started to look at other signs and responses to sexual attraction, right? So, and they actually saw that indeed there are many responses, like for example, the testes get bigger. So they really feel they have all the common responses to sex. And so this kind of closed the loop into understanding why or how they get attracted. Obviously, there are more studies that are being done to understand better the molecular mechanisms, how this is happening. And after all these studies were going on, scientists also were wondering, is this happening with other animals, right? Because there are so many animals infected. Could be something similar happening. And very recently there was a study done in wolves. I don't know if anybody heard about it. It was in the news at the end of last year. And the wolves were reintroduced in Yellowstone National Park a few years ago. And since they were reintroduced, scientists were following them very closely. And one of the things they discovered is that many of these wolves got infected with Toxoplasma. You may wonder how, right? In Yellowstone National Park. And that's what they discovered is because of cougars. All felines can have these parasites. So in the national park, it's believed that the cougars really infected the wolves. And because these wolves were followed very carefully, one of the things they discovered is that a lot of these infected ones became pack leaders. And that's a real risk-taking behavior, because what you have to understand is that wolves normally live in packs, and if one of them goes up by itself, there are great chances that that wolf would not survive. And occasionally, some of them are able to establish a new pack, a new colony. But to do that, you have to be very brave, right? So it is believed that, again, one explanation is that parasite in the brains of wolves. At this point, you may be wondering what happens with us, right? What happens with humans? And one thing we have to know is that the infection is very similar that in other animals, right? So when we get infected, the parasite spreads out, and it switches very fast to this dormant form that are called cysts. And these cysts go to the brain and sit there for the rest of your life. So can this parasite improve your confidence? And so there are a few studies done with people that are suggesting that indeed this parasite could increase risk-taking behaviors. One cute study was done in entrepreneurs. A group of scientists went to events where entrepreneurs meet, and they tested them for the presence of Toxoplasma. There is a very easy test to determine whether you are infected or not. And one of the things they discovered that indeed a lot of entrepreneurs are infected with Toxoplasma. And they proposed a statistical link between being infected and having more chances to start up your own company. And which is obviously another way of risk-taking behaviors, right? And something that was very interesting too from that study is that they ran questionnaires, and one of the questions was about the fear of failure. Right? Most of us have fear of failure, but this group of people seem to have a reduced fear of failure, which is I found that very interesting. And but risk-taking behaviors is not always a good thing, right? And there are other studies that link Toxoplasma-infected people with more car accidents, in particular motorcycle accidents. There were a few studies done in people that died in motorcycle accidents, and they found that their brains were heavily infected with Toxoplasma. So something to have in mind. There is also many studies done in schizophrenia, and it is likely that the parasite may make you more prone to develop schizophrenia. It's not that we should stop and say that's not the causativation, right? So schizophrenia is a complicated disease, and there could be many causes, but the parasite might make you more likely to develop schizophrenia. So, hopefully at this point I got everybody interested in the topic. And so what if you don't want to get toxoplasmosis? And so I dedicated many years of my life to study this parasite. And my training is in genetics, so I was interested in studying the genetics of the parasite, but not anything. I was interested in see if my studies could lead to development of new treatments, right? Because we know that when we get infected for life. So is it possible to develop a new treatment? And that's what I was involved in. And again, I should mention again that the parasites form these cyst forms that evade the autoimmune system attack, and that is how the parasite hides in the body. And there are treatments for the parasite when the parasite is dividing fast and disseminates, but as soon as the parasite hides, there's no treatment for the cysts, to kill the cysts. So I wanted to study cyst formation, how these cysts form, with the idea that that might lead us into hints on how to kill these cysts. And so in my lab, we developed a genetic screen to isolate genes that control cyst formation. And we were able to find a few different genes and study some of the molecules that could be used for developing a new treatment. I cannot go into the technical details, I don't want to lose the audience. But I could discuss that later on if anybody's interested. So at this point, we are in a situation where there are new things that to move forward, a pharmaceutical company would have to get interested to continue developing something that could lead into a new drug. And with that, I want to thank you, everybody, for listening. Time to take questions.
Is it like a blood test, or what do you take?
Yes, it's a blood test. It's a regular blood test. It's normally the OBGYN would have you tested when you get pregnant, and also the other complication could be if you are infected and get another disease that gets your immune system suppressed, and so in those cases you will get tested. Yeah.
How new is that test?
Oh, the test, it's been for many years, and so it's well known that Toxoplasma can cause neurological birth defects, so all around the world pregnant women get tested. What is new is that it may cause behavioral changes. So for a long time, scientists thought that the parasite just sit in the brain and do nothing. That's nothing. But now there is a good question about it.
Can it be passed on to the babies?
Yes. So if you get the infection during pregnancy, the parasite can attack the baby. But if you get infected before pregnancy, then you develop antibodies, and the mother's antibodies will protect the baby. Yeah.
If you want to not get this when you're cleaning a cat box, what should you do? Not.
Probably be careful, wear gloves, and try to not, inhale it. Yeah. But what I should say though, I love cats too, and it is believed that although it's a cat parasite, it is believed that the major route of infection is undercooked meat, because the parasite is shed in the cat feces only for a couple weeks from the cat's life, and it's not such a long period that you can get infected. But a lot of people like to eat undercooked meat. And actually, very interesting that in France, talking about the French Revolution, that's one of the countries that have the highest rate of infection because of that habit of they like eating undercooked meat. Yeah.
That explains that risk-taking behavior during the revolution.
That's right.
Toxoplasma caused the French Revolution.
Are you talking about every kind of
Every
meat?
kind of meat, yeah. Yeah. It's a truly successful parasite. It's all around the world, not only in the land, but in the sea. There is even, sea otters have yeah.
Oh, well, we don't eat sea otters.
Yes. No, regular fish probably not. But it's mainly farm animals. Mammals, yes. Yes.
So I remember hearing a while ago that some viruses which remain dormant in humans recede into the nervous system, and that stress can actually bring out the symptoms because the stress is related to the nervous system, and then so people that are asymptomatic, they're certain. I'm just wondering if it's a similar mechanism.
So usually what happens is that upon immune system attack, a lot of microbes hide in different ways. And stress could reduce your, different kinds of stresses might make you more prone to, like any stress that makes you more prone to get sick because of your immune system. That would be my guess. Yeah.
Is it more prevalent in some areas of the country, or and what would the percentage of the general population would be, the guess of scientists?
The guess is that it depends on different countries. The US is estimated around 30% of the population. That's a lot, yeah. And this is why in most cases it's asymptomatic. People live their entire life without knowing. Yes.
Is it always people with cats?
No, this is, no, it's true. Scientists argue that it's more likely to get it through undercooked meat.
Oh.
Yeah.
Why dogs don't carry these
Oh,
parasites?
they do.
Okay.
Yes, yes, they do.
Another question, why does this parasite enter human body and becomes dormant? Why, what's the cause for that?
It enters the human body like any other animal.
Yeah.
So if we eat undercooked meat, we eat meat that has cysts, and those cysts will get into the body.
Yeah.
And the reason it becomes dormant is because the immune system attacks the parasite. And the only way to survive is to escape that. And so that dormant form is the only one that can escape the immune system attack.
So the human body, we have better, somewhat better immune system, immediately attacks, and it turns into dormant, just stay there.
Yes.
Okay. Versus cats and other mice or other animals, you would have that parasite active in your system.
A lot of
Affect your like senses, yeah, whatever behaviors. Yeah, right?
It depends on the animal. A lot of animals have strong immune systems to switch the parasite into the dormant form. Cats usually never show toxoplasmosis symptoms. Occasionally,
Yeah.
they do.
Okay. And
Yeah.
Mice do, right?
Mice have
Yeah.
a weaker, for that parasite, they have a weaker immune system. They get sicker than other animals. Yes.
Two questions. First of all, can you be reinfected after having it once and become active again? And second question is, if a woman is tested during pregnancy and found to have toxoplasmosis, then what happens then? Why test if? I'm asking what happens.
So the reinfection could happen, but it doesn't really matter because you already have your immune system that is protecting you. So it's not going to change things.
But for example, if a cat can be infected and then shed for less than 2 weeks, as like say, but then if it gets reinfected, does it shed again? Similarly,
It could. It could, but normally it is believed that it's typically once in the life of the cat. And during pregnancy, the test gets done to determine whether you got infected during pregnancy or before. A lot of people are infected before, which is the best scenario. And if they determine that you actually did get infected during pregnancy, you might have to get treated, or in some cases, unfortunately, the parasite leads to an abortion.
so basically it leads to more monitoring of mother and child.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mariana, as you were talking about the connection between this and the sexual behavior of these mice, I was thinking about these somewhat recent infestations of rats, specifically like down in North Attleboro area. They're having a issue with that. Could this be linked to some of these large-scale infestations of rodents that we see pop up from time to time? Would this serve to sort of explain some of that increase in those numbers, do you think?
I don't know if that this is related to that. I really don't know, but it could be really anything. The only thing that happens is that if they are infected, they are going to get there's going to be a larger amount carried of toxoplasmosis.
Matrajt, I have a question before we let you go to your seat. Can this Toxoplasma be used as cure? I know there's an ethical part to it, but for those shy introverts, those who don't want to take risks, like me, who is afraid to go to the president's office.
I don't know, but something that I do know is that the U.S. military was interested.
There you go. I could try. All right, yes. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Steve Dooner, Professor of English and Theater at Quincy College. In addition to teaching at Quincy College since 1990, Professor Dooner has pursued his lifelong passion for drama by acting, directing, and writing for the stage. His production of the Beccari by Euripides was the American Repertory Theater's official selection for the first Boston Fringe Festival. At Quincy College, we all know Professor Steve Dooner as a superb teacher and advisor to Quincy College Drama Club, who somehow manages to bring out the actor and performer from even our most shy or reluctant students without the virus. Tonight, Professor Dooner will talk about his play, Lizzie of Fall River, which provides the backstory to the famous Borden family murders that took place in Fall River in 1892. Tonight, I'm so glad that you will get to know him as well. Professor Steve Dooner.
Thank you. Well, it's quite a night. Heads will roll. Mice, cats, and now this. Axe murders. How a good way to end the night. Well, I don't know. I feel depressed. I feel as if something was hanging over me that I cannot throw off. And it comes over me at times no matter where I am. I don't know, but somebody may do something. Lizzie Borden, according to her friend Alice Russell, said this on the day before the murders. And it was one of the most interesting things, the diction that she uses, that old 19th century, I don't know, but what somebody may do something, was something I knew I wanted in my play the minute I heard it. But it's an interesting thing. There's so many theories about whether Lizzie did it or didn't. These theories become a Rorschach for whoever takes up this play, and for whoever studies this subject. Lizzie Borden is the subject of explosive speculation. She's been a persistent source of curiosity and horror since that day in 1892, August 4th. Her story was immediately sensationalized in the media, and the trial became a circus for the public, and it was immediately known as the trial of the century. Of course, it was only one of many trials of the century, and we still keep having them. Before the era of Twitter and TMZ, the newspapers of the time were savage in their immediate indictment of Lizzie. In my play, Judge Blaisdell, who runs the inquest and who interrogates Lizzie, is reading the old Daily Globe, the ancestor of the Boston Globe, and he reads this, quote, this is from a newspaper in 1892. And yet it seems impossible to think no scream was heard by the servant, no fall disturbed the sleeper above. No step of murderer was heard till he had completed his work in the sitting room below. That's the murder of her father. The character of the wounds bears out the thought that Mrs. Borden was killed first. She was battered and clubbed. He was cut and cut again, as though the crazed fiend was finding a delight in his work and was determined to carve and not to blunder by clubbing. One policeman of long service said, no one but a crazed woman would commit such a deed as that by which Mr. Borden went into eternity. It's the old Boston Globe or Daily Globe of 1892. Well, that's the sort of thing that people saw immediately in this story. She was the daughter of one of the richest men in town. He had $430,000 in 1892, which in today's money is roughly $14 million. And yet his house was very modest. It did have a flushing toilet, but it did not have running water, and other houses in the nearby area did. And he was known for keeping up a kind of slovenly house. I think you'll see in some of the photos, and yes, you will see crime scene photos in this presentation. I'll warn you. But the nice thing is that the versions that I have are blurred out a bit, so they won't be too shocking. In 1999, I was asked to direct a Halloween play at the Company Theatre in Norwell. They wanted the story of Lizzie Borden, and they immediately assumed I would select one of many plays that have already been written on Lizzie Borden. I saw an opportunity and I immediately said, "Can I write it?" And they said, "Sure." I had a year to do it, and I worked on it a lot. I found a friend who had written a chapter of one of his books on Lizzie Borden. It was called New England's Most Sensational Murders, and I started working on the play. And then by luck, I found the Lizzie Borden inquest, which became the structure of my play. They brought her in, hyped up on morphine, and asked her a whole range of questions. And she gave the most extraordinary, inadmissible answers you could possibly imagine. And I thought this was something that can't be considered history, like Jim Fox would ever use such a source for history, nor could it ever be considered scientific because of Lizzie's stain. But it is the perfect fodder for drama. And so the inquest testimony, as we trot through it in the play, suddenly explodes or expands into scenes. And we would reenact the scene. And we had reenacted the last 2 weeks up to the moment that the murders occur. Lizzie is a cottage industry for playwrights and television dramatists. Here are some of the titles of Lizzie Borden plays since 1934. 9 Pine Street. Okay. Goodbye, here, she lived on 2nd Street. Goodbye, Miss Lizzie Borden. That's her title. The Lights Are Warm and Colored. Lizzie Borden, I don't know what that one's about. Lizzie, exclamation point, The Fall River Tragedy. Lizzie Borden, The Fall River. That's by the high school playwright Tim Kelly. Miss Lizzie Borden invites you to tea. The Fall River Axe Murders. Television, and there were television movies. The Legend of Lizzie Borden, starring Elizabeth Montgomery of Bewitched, where she commits the entire crime naked. Right? Television series, the Lizzie Borden Chronicles, starring Christina Ricci, who is Wednesday Addams, if you may have heard of her. One of the older Wednesday Addams. And there's an episode of Alfred Hitchcock's Presents, and even an episode of the Simpsons annual Halloween show, Treehouse of Horror. So Lizzie has been treated everywhere, and people still ask questions about it. But I wanted to explore its relevance to us today. And I also wanted to consider how it explained the culture of Fall River at the time, and how it might talk about New England today. That's what I thought that this story did. I actually felt Lizzie Borden is, in a way, New England. I know. So I titled my play Lizzie of Fall River. I wanted it to sound like Anne of Green Gables. and I wanted her to be part of her environment. And so I chose 2 characters. Let me jump ahead. Here's the house here's 92 2nd Street, the house of Andrew Borden. Not that big for a 14 millionaire. Here's the Patriot Ledger feature on the play. Here's Lizzie Borden, the Sunday school teacher, and our Lizzie Borden from our play, Brittany Rolfs. She's a wonderful actress. She made me rethink the entire role when I did it in 2019. And of course, the historic crime scene, which we'll get to in a minute. Lizzie Borden's story is resorted. I said like a Rorschach, and I think that's the interesting thing. Some people, such as those in the Daily Globe, saw it as only a woman could commit such a horrible crime. Of course, she was acquitted by an all-male jury because no woman could commit such a crime. They were incapable of another insult. Everything was an insult, every which way you went. Women couldn't commit such a crime, but hey, she was a spinster and she wasn't married. So of course she could commit such a crime. And then there were allusions to her sexuality. There were a number of other reasons why they would say Lizzie did it. But I wanted to figure out who would be the murderer, and I didn't choose Lizzie in my play. And I needed it to be a very dramatic story, and I wanted it to stay as close to the history of the events as possible. And so, if you can, I want to show you the famous crime scene. I want to talk a little bit about some of the relevant details as we do this. So I'm going to show you these are some shocking images. Let me explain. The crime scene photography was entirely brand new. 4 years before, during the Jack the Ripper murders, there was some limited photography being used. They photographed the faces of Mary Kelly and the other victims of Jack the Ripper. That's about it. The morgue faces of the victims. Mugshots, essentially. Alphonse Bertillon in France had created the forensic science of crime photography as essentially a version of phrenology. You know, they measured, they wanted to catch the criminal profile, the criminal jaw. They even measured people's finger lengths. And Alphonse Bertillon actually testified, trying to prove that Dreyfus did it in the Dreyfus affair. Forensic science was very close to very scandalous in its early days. And it's so extraordinary how much it's changed and transformed into an aid to legal pursuits. So here we go. This is the Abby Borden crime scene. And if you notice, she died face forward. She was hit from behind. She was in her slip, so they put a dress on her. They did not keep this crime scene as it was, and they put a skirt on her. And you might want to notice that they did something else with this second photo. What did they do? What is it? They moved the bed. Well, you got to get it on this angle. There was no sense that we had to keep the crime scene exactly as it was. All right? They redressed the corpse and put her back in her position. They moved the bed. They thought they were so cutting edge. They really thought they were going to use science to solve this crime. Here's Andrew Borden. I'm very glad this is actually blurred out for you. What people notice about it is his coat, which he prized. It was one of those federal coats that looked sort of like an apron, buttoned in the back. You kind of look like a chef when you wore them. You see J.P. Morgan wearing them. It was a very fancy coat, but it's bundled up underneath his head. Somebody tucked it under his head after bludgeoning him. That's an odd detail, isn't it? Propping up his head after he was dead. And then interestingly enough, look at the worn rug. The rug is worn entirely away. And so there's some debate about whether this 14 millionaire was a skinflint, but I think he could have afforded a better rug, right? And money seems to be part of the reason why this crime was committed. Here's the axe they found. And this became a big O.J. Simpson trial moment in the actual trial. When they found the bodies, they left them there for hours because the police were having a police picnic. And they finally arrived at the crime scene. And they kept them there about a day at the crime scene, and they photographed it and moved things around. And there's a wonderful photo of a fellow smoking a big cigar right next to the bodies. And then they decided they needed to do a full autopsy. Even though it was clear they died from bludgeoning head wounds, they did a full autopsy, and they would do it in the kitchen of the Borden house. They moved both bodies to the kitchen, and these photos exist. They're not in my presentation. You do not want to see them. They are gruesome photos of this, sort of very autopsy done in 1892. And then after they did the autopsy on the bodies, they said, well, we better bring them to the cemetery. But they didn't want to bury them because they were worried about losing evidence. So they brought them to the cemetery and they held them there for days. Then finally they decided, okay, we can bury them, but they stopped immediately and they said, but cut off their heads first. And so they beheaded both of the corpses, they took the heads, and then they buried the bodies. Then they brought the heads back, and they do whatever you do with heads. They boiled them down and removed the flesh with acid, and then they got the skulls. And they brought the skulls of Andrew Borden and Abby Borden into the trial. Here is the back of Abby's head. All right? And you can see it was somebody very violently attacked her. Did she get 40 whacks? No, actually, 18. They said maybe 18 whacks is what they actually think. And then here's his skull, and you can see the whole side of his face is caved in. And he was attacked by somebody on this side of his face. And what's interesting is when they brought that axe into the courtyard, into the courtroom, they could not make it match any of these wounds. It was very much like the bloody glove moment, you know, in O.J. Simpson's trial. It was terrible, terrible jurisprudence. In my play, I have Dr. Dolan, the man in charge of all of these autopsies, come in and say how much he's proud of his forensic science. The first words of the play, not spoken by Lizzie, are, "The modern world has come to Fall River, Mr. Knowlton. I think you'll be very pleased. We were able to bring the camera and tripod to the house within hours of the discovery of the body. Not even Boston's police could have responded sooner. We photographed both the father and the mother as they were found." Not true. Nothing was disturbed? Doesn't seem so. Unless the maid or Miss Borden had a reason to touch something. And of course, as the play goes on, we find out that that isn't the case. The displays of Andrew's skull in court sent a shockwave. This is an actual crime scene illustration. And I think there's some value to these illustrations over the photographs because the artist targets your sense, your direction, what you're looking at. When they brought that skull into the court, people knew that the trial was a fiasco. You know, it was just unseemly. They thought that the actual prosecution was doing things that were far creepier than the actual murders. And so they brought the skull in and they tried to examine it, and they had a very awkward moment when the axe wouldn't work. Lizzie fainted in court when they read her plea. There was a wonderful district attorney, Moody, who read this resounding, full of oral rotundities, damning case against her, and she immediately collapsed. And so people became sympathetic to her. And when, at the end of the play, she hid her face and wept as the verdict was read, and she was found not guilty. Not guilty. She got all of her father's money. She moved up onto the hill to a beautiful new house called Maplecroft. It was a resplendent house with running water. She lived out a really great lifetime afterwards, and we'll have to talk about that, but she was shunned from society. Here's the all-male jury. I just enjoy the idea that they photographed the jury. You know, we're so proud of what we did. So when I decided to write my play, I used the inquest, and I used two characters, Judge Josiah Knowlton and Hosea. They all have biblical names. Hosea Knowlton and Josiah Blaisdell. And Josiah Blaisdell became the kind of interlocutors. And they allowed me to contextualize a lot of the information of the play that I think you might find interesting. Blaisdell at one point says, "Listen, these Bordens are a branch of the same family that resides up there on the hill. The father ran 3 mills in town with more irate immigrant workers than I care to think about. I'm sure if we look into it, we could find plenty of people in this town with a reason to hate Andrew Jackson Borden. Before we drag the daughter through some tawdry spectacle, keep in mind, the Borden name is known to everyone." Yes, it is. This is the same, they were a branch of the family that we now know as Borden Foods, Borden Condensed Milk, and they did not want to necessarily associate with the Andrew Jackson Borden side of their family. And so that name was big in New England even back then. And so the fact that it was being dragged through the press meant that people were trying to get this story, get this trial done with. And then her stepmother was Abby Durfee Borden. And she didn't kill her mother, by the way. I should mention that too. She killed her stepmother, and that's one of the crux issues of the entire story. It was Abby Borden that Lizzie had an issue with. The Borden women, in my play, because it was done for Halloween, I actually included the real mother of Lizzie and Emma. Her name was Sarah Borden, and she died young. Some people think Andrew Jackson Borden drove her to her death. And he was a very hard man. This is Abby Borden. Here we have Emma, the older sister, who was 42, and Lizzie, who was 32. The tension for me between Lizzie and Abby was one of the things that I found very interesting. I wanted to emphasize the women roles in this. I mean, I get so many great, strong women actors, and they can play wonderful parts. And so I took a photo of them in front of the house. There they are, they're in front of the actual house. Lizzie, in the inquest, this is her actual words, it was written directly to my play, had an issue with her mother, her stepmother, over a house Here it is. What was the trouble you had with your mother 5 years ago? My stepmother, she said. My father bought the house for Mrs. Borden. She did not tell me, and he did not tell me, but some outsiders said that he gave it to her, put it in her name. I said if he gave that to her, he ought to give us something. Told Mrs. Borden so. She did not care anything about the house herself. She wanted it so this half-sister could have a home because she had married a man that was not doing the best he could. We always thought she persuaded father to buy it. At any rate, he did buy it. And I'm quite sure she did persuade him. I said that what he did for her people, he ought to do for his own children. So he gave us grandfather's house. So they were fighting. Now, what's interesting about this little dialogue, which is her real words, and I used it right in my play, is that 5 years before this, Lizzie was known to have called Abby mother. Her real mother died before she could remember her. And she grew up with Abby Borden and called her mother. But this issue over the house severed that relationship. And from that point, methodically, Lizzie called her Mrs. Borden. Here at the inquest, this is what she's doing. She calls her Mrs. Borden. And when the questioner, Blaisdell, says, your mother, she corrects him and says, Mrs. Borden. It became a very thorny issue. That's actually on the record. Meanwhile, her relationship with Andrew Borden was both a bond and a tension. It was originally very good. She said that most people thought that Lizzie was the apple of her father's eye, that they had a very strong father-daughter relationship. And this was until he married the stepmother. And then the tension blew up between them. And there are a number of events that continue through the play. Some in the days just before are kind of interesting and something to think about. Emma Borden said that she saw a strange man walking about the back, of the house. They kept saying there were strange people about the house. On the day before the murder, the entire house became terribly sick, and Abby Borden called the local doctor in because she was convinced that Lizzie had poisoned her. Lizzie had tried to buy poison a week before. Prussic acid to clean a sealskin cape. And so this was all brought out at the trial. Of course, some people think that there's a much more pedestrian answer for why the family got so sick that day. It was August 3rd, during a 10-day heat wave. Every day was over 90 degrees, and the family had been eating from the same pot of cold mutton soup for 10 days straight. And they probably had what was known as summer sickness because they recovered. But it's interesting. They also blamed the Irish maid because the Irish maid didn't eat it and she didn't get sick. And these are the same players that are there that day, a day later, when the actual murders occur. There's one other detail which is interesting, and was particularly interesting to the famous playwright Susan Glasgow, that they had a barn full of pigeons. And Andrew Borden came in one day, this is the inquest testimony, and he had snapped the necks of the pigeons in the barn. Can you tell of the killing of any animal or any other operation that would lead to their being cast there with blood on them? No, sir. He killed some pigeons in the barn last May or June. What with? I don't know, but I thought he wrung their necks. What made you think so? I think he said so. Did anything else make you think so? All but 3 or 4 had their heads on. That is what made me think so. Did you tell anybody they looked as though they were twisted off? I don't remember whether I did or not. The skin, I think, was very tender. I said, why are these heads off? I think I remember of telling somebody that. He said, they twisted off. Did they look as if they were cut off? I don't know. I did not look at that particularly. It's a very strange moment, and this happened a few weeks before the actual murders. It bears on the conclusion. I went through the other suspects in the play, and there were several. One was a man named Tom Borden. He was a very odd fellow who went around the town carrying a hatchet, talking to himself. Some people thought he was the illegitimate son of Andrew Borden. This is brought out in many books on Lizzie Borden. Emma left town. The older sister left town the day or two before the murders. She wasn't there, she can't be a suspect. Uncle John Morse left town on the day of the murders and has an iron-tight alibi. In fact, he seems to have shaken hands and said hello to everybody at every train station along the way. The Portuguese workers down in his factories were blamed for it, and of course the Irish maid. And again, people saw the villains that they wanted to see based on whatever particular prejudices they had. The Portuguese worker, the Irish servant, the uncle who had probably asked Andrew for a loan. Did he arrange the murder? Emma leaving town, both of them leaving the house just as this occurred. Bridget Maggie O'Sullivan was thought by many, out of pure prejudice, to have done it, but she was actually known to have been washing windows outside the house that day. And she was seen all day long washing windows. She had a perfect alibi. And many plays have been written about that make her the actual murderer. And those plays, of course, choose her because probably of her ethnicity. Also because she was thought to have just disappeared right after the trial. Nobody knew what happened to Bridget Maggie O'Sullivan. By the way, her name was Bridget O'Sullivan, but they called her Maggie because their previous Irish maid was called Maggie. So they didn't want to change. We'll call you Maggie too. And she probably had a fun time with it living in that house. Recently, just 2 or 3 years ago, they found a new image of Bridget O'Sullivan. She lived out her life in Anaconda, Montana. And she didn't just mysteriously disappear. She went farming, married, and changed her life. But this is my final cast, and I call the play Lizzie of Fall River primarily because I brought in each of these scenarios. We explored them all, and at the end, I felt the best story for my audience would be the story of Lizzie. Why? The mother, the tension with the mother is particularly interesting. Who could walk up behind her and bludgeon her to death so easily in her bedroom? Lizzie was said to have not been in that part of the house. She was said to be up in the barn eating peaches. Eating pears up in the barn. Why she would go on the hottest day of the year to the loft of a barn to eat pears where it's boiling hot is a very strange thing, but that's what she said she was doing. In the play, I wanted to think about what was the issue? Was it just a house? Was it just property? Were these just spoiled rich children? Or was there something else? And the father, of course, in each of my final scenes of the play, I do reenact the structure of the crime scene and suggest the famous crime photos. And I think, for me, it came down to two things. The nature of Andrew Borden's face being hacked in. I read somewhere that when somebody is abused sexually, that they often attack the face of their abuser. And I read that and I thought, isn't it interesting that Abby was attacked from the back and Andrew was attacked from the front, or the side to his face. The person was destroying specific things in each of them. And I found that particularly interesting. And then the pigeons also struck me, as it struck Susan Glasgow, as a particularly interesting clue, because Lizzie went to the top of that hill, lived in a new house, Maplecroft. And she had a great friend of hers, a companion, who was an actress, Nance O'Neill. And the two of them lived for a while there, and Nance went out and moved away. And Lizzie lived out the rest of her years very well. She had theater parties. She hung out with actors and actresses. She was shunned by society, but she loved animals. And when she finally died, she gave all of Andrew Jackson Borden's money to the ASPCA. And I thought that might be a tell. So, thank you, everybody. Oh, questions? Yes, go ahead.
Three really quick questions. So, because of the mutton, do you think that they could have had toxoplasmosis?
Or E. coli.
And then might have been somebody might have been aggressive and,
Yeah. I was thinking about the rats. Rats have E. coli all over them, but no, that's a good thought. I like it.
Second question was, look, when you showed the skull, the skull that caved in from the right, which would suggest that somebody was a lefty.
Right.
So was Lizzie a lefty?
It's interesting. She was actually right-handed.
So I'm watching too much CSI every night.
Right.
There are a lot of repeats, so I'm learning.
But she may have been standing on that side of his body, but it is interesting, you know. The way I position her is that she's behind him as she does it. And that's the sort of position with the pillow, with the coat behind him.
Right, but it
So
looked,
we
like,
actually talked
it looked
about
like it was sort of from the front.
Yeah. It is from the front and the side, yeah.
So.
But I
Might have
agree,
been a lefty.
that actually fits my thesis better. It's right from directly from the front.
Right, so it might have been a lefty.
If it were from the front, being right-handed might have been the perfect way to do it. Yeah.
And then third question is, who do you think did it?
In real life, I honestly think I struggle with it, and Bridget O'Sullivan certainly had an alibi, so I don't think so. There are a couple of details that I didn't bring out. When Bridget came to the house, she heard Lizzie laughing upstairs. She told this to the inquest. This was after Abby was supposed to have been murdered. Lizzie was upstairs, where she was murdered, laughing. Another thing is that if you visit the home, you'll see that Lizzie was supposed to be then upstairs later, while Andrew Borden was murdered, and she was supposed to have been, she was right below Abby when Abby was murdered. She was right below ironing. She heard no bludgeoning. She was ironing in the room below. And then, when Andrew Borden was murdered, she was supposed to be up in that loft eating pears. So when I think about it, it's very strange to be up in that loft. The Borden house and the tensions in the house were very real. Lizzie was accused of things on the day before. The prussic acid incident really is true. The druggist refused to sell her the prussic acid, unlike Miss Emily, in Rose Remily. She did not get the prussic acid, and so did she put something else in their stew? I don't know. Or did she even try to poison them at all? There are so many details that keep bringing me back home to her. But I can tell you that if she did it, there was real dialogue about her feeling waves of depression, and that she loses herself. There was like a darkness falling over her all the time. She says that in numerous places, not just to Alice Russell. And then for the rest of her life, she lives pretty well. And maybe her revenge finally was living well. She doesn't seem racked with guilt, if that's the case. But I tend to think, yes, I tend to think that the jury was wrong. And it wasn't because she was a spinster, and I don't think it was because she was unmarried or a Sunday school teacher. I think it was because there was something seriously wrong in the home.
Blood on them? If they whack somebody like that?
That's why in the Elizabeth Montgomery movie, she was naked, because that would be the perfect way to not have any spattering on your clothing. One theorist said that's a far-out theory that she committed the crimes nude. But I think what's more interesting is this, that Lizzie was in the vicinity of both of the crimes. And then when they came, they said she didn't have any blood on her and they dismissed her. But the Saturday after the crimes, she suddenly decided to burn a dress that was spattered with paint.
Oh, man.
And she decided to burn it in the stove, and their big giant iron stove. And she brought the dress in, and Emma was furious with her. This is the worst thing you could have done, she wrote in a letter, Lizzie. You should not have burned that dress. And Alice Russell confirmed that she saw her burning the dress, and it was spattered with red paint. So it's a very interesting detail that maybe she somehow cleaned herself sufficiently and squirreled away a dress. It's possible. And there's something on the record that suggests that did occur. Yeah.
Yeah. How old was Lizzie Borden when she died, and what year?
She was, let's see, I'm not sure. I think she died about 70 years old, but she lived a long life. And she was 32 when the crime was committed, and but about that. Yeah.
Okay, so about 35 years after 1892.
Yeah.
Okay.
She lived a long life, yeah. In fact, the first 10 years she lived with Nance O'Neill, and then she lived out a number of years just by herself. She did not meet Nance till 10 years after the crime. And then she lived with her for a while, and then she lived on for another 10 years after that, about 30 years later. Yeah. Yep.
So you said she was shunned, but I mean, did she have like people working for her, like servants and things like that, because she had such a big house?
Well, she was shunned before. You know, Andrew Jackson Borden was not accepted socially by the other Bordens. And even though he had $14 million, and they should have been young socialites, they weren't. And then after the crime, of course, they could not admit her to proper society. One thing that I really think is important is that people think of Fall River as it is today, which is a very depressed community. Fall River was the end of the textile run from, if you read Death of a Salesman, that's where all the textiles were made. All the salesmen went to Fall River, they got the textiles and brought them back to the garment district in Greenwich Village. So there was a continuous line of money, and Fall River was outrageously rich. It was a very wealthy community with the Bordens, the Durfees, and a number of other families. So for me, if you really think back to that time period, it was all very much the WASP culture, right? The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture of New England. It was a very rich Brahmin city, and they wanted to compete with Boston. That's why I wrote in my play, we did better than the Boston police. They wanted to be the new Boston. They were up and coming. Of course, the textile industry would collapse with international commerce and merchants, and Fall River would become the very depressed place it is today. But for a little while, it was Boston, Fall River, New York. Yes?
Is there a museum in Fall River with the skull and the
Yeah, the house has, the skull is in the Historical Society of Fall River. The house has a replica of the skull. If you go to the house, you can actually go to the very spots where all these things occur. And every time I've done the show twice, and then I did it with a youth group who did it another time. We always make a pilgrimage to the place it occurred, and it's very odd. It's a very odd feeling to walk into that house, even 100 years later, to know this is the place where this historic crime occurred. And you can walk up and you can see that's where she left. Well, she was just up at the top of a winding staircase, and she would have been very near the body of Abby if she left from that spot. And she didn't see Abby in that room. Well, her leg might have been sticking out from behind the bed, but it's very strange that body wasn't discovered for hours later. And then where she was, you feel how close this is. Andrew Jackson Borden didn't want to associate with Lizzie, and so he nailed the doors shut on their side of the house. So in order to go over to Lizzie Borden's side, where Emma was, they had to go all the way around the house and walk through the back door. That's where the servants were, at Lizzie's room, and Andrew had his life with Abby on the front side of the house. There was some serious walls up between this family, and it's pretty interesting when you go to the house and see how it was.
Thank you, Professor Dooner. Thank you all very much for participating in this event. Before we all adjourn to the hors d'oeuvres and refreshments, I would like to ask you one more round of applause for our tremendous speakers. Our scholarship, teaching and learning team. And all dedicated staff from technology, facilities, security, library, online learning, marketing, and academic affairs, who worked hard to make sure this event was a success. Yes, this evening's event was just the first in a series of opportunities to learn with and from our talented Quincy College faculty. There's a sign-up sheet and QR code for easy scan. Please please provide your name and contact information so that we can inform you for future events. Once again, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of the evening as you enjoy the food and mingle with our speakers. Thank you.